I weaponized my training as a therapist to gaslight my husband. I cheated, lied, and manipulated like I was untouchable. I thought I could outsmart guilt, but it cost me my marriage, my career, my dignity, and the fallout destroyed everything I built. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who ruined her own life. That phrase sounds dramatic, but when you're sitting in the quiet of an empty apartment with the hum of a broken fridge as your only companion, you realize drama is just the truth in sharper focus. I used to help people fix their lives. I was a licensed therapist, respected, steady, the one who always seemed to have it together. My husband, Daniel, trusted that image more than anyone. He trusted me more than anyone. And I broke that. Not with one mistake, but with a long series of choices I justified one by one until there was nothing left to justify. I tell myself I was lonely, overworked, disconnected. The truth is, I was arrogant. I thought I was smarter than everyone else, including the people I loved. I believed that because I understood emotions professionally, I could manage them personally, that I could manipulate outcomes, smooth over guilt, and walk away unscathed. It's pathetic when I write it out like this. But that's what I did. I manipulated my husband while I was cheating on him, managing his reactions like he was a client instead of a person. When he'd sense something was off, I'd turn it around, gaslight him, twist his words, use therapy jargon to make him doubt himself. I told myself I was just preserving harmony. In truth, I was maintaining control. The affair started small, messages, long conversations, subtle emotional lines crossed. It became physical a few months later. I compartmentalized it completely. During the day I'd listen to clients talk about trust, boundaries, accountability. At night, I'd delete messages and lie about late sessions. I was so certain no one would find out. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Not when you're living two lives. The first domino fell on a Sunday morning. Daniel had borrowed my laptop to send a file while his was updating. I'd forgotten to log out of a messaging app I rarely used. He didn't mean to look, or maybe he did, but the truth stared him in the face. Screenshots, messages, proof of everything. When I came home from yoga, the laptop was open on the kitchen table. He didn't yell. He just asked, "How long?" That silence before my answer stretched longer than our entire marriage felt in that moment. I told him the truth, mostly. I said it had been a few months. It had been almost a year. He moved out the next day. I remember thinking I could fix it, that I just needed to give him space. I even drafted what I called a reconciliation plan, like it was a client treatment strategy. I still thought I could manage the fallout, that if I sounded reasonable enough, contrite enough, it would all smooth over. But Daniel wasn't one of my clients. He didn't know me understanding. He told my family everything before I had a chance to twist it. My parents were horrified. My sister told me, flat out, that I reaped what I sowed. It stung because it was true. My job found out next. Not directly from Daniel, he's not vindictive, but because word spreads fast in small communities. One of my clients saw him packing his car and asked him how he was doing. He told her, briefly and honestly. She mentioned it in session, not the details, but enough that my supervisor got wind of ethical concerns. I was placed under review pending an investigation by the state board. My stomach dropped when I saw the email. My license had been spotless for 10 years. I had worked so hard to build that credibility. But actions have consequences, even for therapists. Especially for therapists. The investigation moved faster than I expected. They called in clients to review my boundaries, asked about dual relationships, emotional oversteps. Nothing criminal, but the pattern was clear: blurred lines, poor judgment, a professional who thought she could separate her personal and ethical worlds indefinitely. When they suspended my license pending disciplinary action, I sat in the office parking lot and sobbed until my throat burned. That was the first time I realized my life was truly falling apart. Money tightened quickly after that. Therapy income vanished, and with it went the apartment we'd shared. I had savings, but divorce filings, legal fees, and the suspension process drained it faster than I could comprehend. I sold my car to pay rent for one more month. My diet changed because it had to. I went from fresh salads and tofu stir-fry to 99-cent ramen and frozen burritos. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd get back on my feet. But every temporary decision became permanent when my reputation made it impossible to find work in counseling. My parents offered to let me move in for a while, but it wasn't really an offer. It was pity wrapped in disappointment. Every conversation with my mother ended with the same phrase, "You brought this on yourself." She was right, but hearing it daily didn't make it easier. My sister stopped responding to texts. Even my friends from grad school distanced themselves. Nobody wanted to be associated with a disgraced therapist under investigation for misconduct and deceit. The man I cheated with? He ghosted me within a week of the truth coming out. He told me he couldn't handle the drama. I don't even blame him. I'd been using him as much as I used everyone else. When the consequences started to fall, I was alone, exactly as I deserved. Each day became a test of survival. I took temporary work at a call center, then lost it when they ran background checks. I started selling furniture piece by piece: the couch, the coffee table, the bed frame. The irony wasn't lost on me. The therapist who once guided others through crises couldn't manage her own. Every morning I'd wake up and repeat the same line in my head: actions have consequences. It was like a mantra I couldn't escape. One night, I walked past a coffee shop I used to frequent with clients. Through the window, I saw one of them laughing with another therapist, my replacement, probably. I wanted to disappear. But I also felt something else: clarity. This was what accountability looked like. No more excuses, no more control. Just reality. The board hearing came 3 months later. They reviewed the findings: ethical breaches, failure to maintain professional boundaries, conduct unbecoming of the license. I lost it. Not permanently, but indefinitely. The chairwoman looked at me and said, "You reaped what you sowed, Ms. Turner." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. Afterward, I sat in my car with the letter in my hands. It was official: my career was over, my marriage was gone, my family estranged. I'd hit a low I never thought possible. And yet, the strangest part was the silence. No one to blame, nowhere to run. Just me, facing the wreckage I built. That was the day I stopped pretending I could control outcomes. I moved into a small studio, barely bigger than my old office. The rent was cheap because the neighborhood wasn't great. I ate ramen twice a day and learned to stretch $1 until it screamed. Every other paragraph of my life, every new event, brought another small loss: my car, my friends, my clients, my dignity. But underneath the ruin, there was a sliver of something almost like peace. I stopped seeing myself as the therapist who fell. I started seeing myself as a person who broke the rules of her own making and faced the consequences. I didn't deserve sympathy. I deserved to start over, if that was even possible. After losing my license, I thought there couldn't be much else to lose. But consequences don't work on a schedule. They show up whenever they please, and sometimes, they bring friends. I started to understand that when the letters started arriving: bills, collection notices, the remnants of a life I couldn't afford anymore. Daniel filed for divorce officially, and seeing my name next to his one last time on legal paper hurt more than any argument we ever had. I didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight for. We didn't have children, no joint business, no real assets beyond a few savings accounts that were already empty. Still, the court fees piled up, and I found myself pawning jewelry I used to wear to conferences, the kind that made me feel professional, composed. Now they just looked like artifacts from another person's life. My days took on a strange rhythm. Wake up, stare at the ceiling for too long, make instant coffee that tasted like metal, scroll job listings I wasn't qualified for anymore. Even the ones that didn't require a license: coaching, administrative work, mental health tech, all demanded references. I didn't have any left who'd return my calls. When rent came due and my balance didn't match, I finally sold my wedding ring. The pawn shop guy didn't ask questions, just waited, quoted a number that felt insulting, and slid the cash across the counter. I took it without argument. That night, I made ramen again. It's funny how fast the palate adjusts. I used to plan meals around nutrient balance, now I counted calories by the flavor packet. Every time I told myself it couldn't get worse, life corrected me. My landlord raised rent by $50 with no notice. My car, the cheap used one I'd bought after selling the first, got towed when I couldn't keep up with the insurance. My phone stopped working for 3 days because I forgot to pay the bill. I started walking everywhere, to the grocery store, to the unemployment office, to nowhere in particular when I couldn't stand the walls anymore. I ran into a former colleague on one of those walks. She crossed the street when she saw me. Maybe it wasn't intentional, maybe it was. Either way, it told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't just unemployed, I was radioactive. In the therapy world, reputation was currency, and mine was bankrupt. Then came the hearing from the ethics committee, a follow-up evaluation to decide if I'd ever be eligible for reinstatement. They asked for evidence of rehabilitation and moral fitness. I didn't have either. I tried to write a statement about accountability, about how actions have consequences, about how I'd learned from my mistakes. But the words felt empty, like I was plagiarizing my own therapy notes. When the rejection came, it wasn't dramatic. Just an envelope, a few sentences saying the board had denied my petition for reinstatement for a minimum of 5 years. I read it twice, then 3 times, until the paper blurred. It didn't surprise me, but it still hollowed me out. I had officially lost the only identity I'd ever built for myself. I started drinking cheap wine at night, not to escape, just to fill the space where meaning used to live. I watched the kind of TV I used to tell clients was emotional numbing. I laughed at the irony. When people say rock bottom, they usually mean a single moment. For me, it was a series of small humiliations that added up until there was nothing left to protect. My parents stopped sending money after I missed a repayment I'd promised. My mom wrote me an email, short, polite, cutting, "We love you, but love doesn't mean we can ignore consequences." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Every bridge I'd burned still smoked in the background. Then one afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a client, a former one. She said she'd heard what happened and wanted to know if I was okay. I almost cried, not because she cared, but because it reminded me of who I used to be. I told her I was fine. I wasn't. But it wasn't her job to carry my guilt. I picked up part-time work at a grocery store stocking shelves at night. It was humbling, quiet, almost meditative. No one there knew who I was or what I'd done. I was just another tired face in a uniform. I told myself that was enough. For a while, it was. Then the store manager found out I used to be a therapist. He started asking for advice during breaks, about his marriage, his stress. I answered politely, but inside, I felt the old arrogance stirring. I had to stop. I couldn't let myself play that role again. I told him I wasn't licensed anymore, that I couldn't ethically give advice. He laughed it off, said, "Once a therapist, always a therapist." I didn't laugh back. The humiliation deepened when the divorce finalized. I saw Daniel's new social media profile by accident. He looked happy, leaner, sharper, alive in a way he hadn't been with me. He'd met someone new, a teacher. I felt a pang of jealousy that disgusted me. He'd moved on. He'd healed. I was the one still bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. One night, I got sick from the cheap food and wine. I spent hours on the bathroom floor, thinking about how far I'd fallen. I used to counsel people about self-care, about boundaries, about respecting themselves. Now I couldn't even afford vegetables. It wasn't just poverty, it was poetic justice. I had treated trust like currency, and now I was bankrupt in every sense of the word. The next morning, I decided to get help. I went to a community center and joined a support group, not for addiction or infidelity, but for career loss and public shame. Most people there were ex-teachers, ex-nurses, people who'd made one mistake too many. Listening to them was humbling. Everyone had a version of "I thought I could get away with it." Everyone was paying for that illusion. Week by week, I started to talk more openly. I didn't defend myself. I just told the truth. It wasn't cathartic, it was mechanical at first. But honesty, stripped of performance, felt cleaner than anything I'd practiced before. I realized I'd never been honest for its own sake. Always strategic, always calculated. Now, I had no one left to manipulate, so I finally told the truth. Then another letter arrived, this time from a journalist. She was writing an article about ethical breaches in mental health professions and wanted to include my case anonymously. I almost declined, but then I thought maybe it was one more layer of accountability. I agreed, on the condition she changed my name. She did. When the article came out, I read it twice. Seeing my story laid bare, stripped of excuses, was sobering. I didn't come off as a villain or a victim, just a human who'd made catastrophic choices. That piece made its way around local circles, and for the first time, I got messages from strangers. Some sympathetic, some cruel. One said simply, "You deserved it." I didn't disagree. I responded, "I know. Actions have consequences." For months, my life stayed small. Work, home, group meetings. I learned to stretch meals, to be grateful when the light stayed on. My pride eroded, but so did my self-pity. Every new situation, every eviction notice, every cold night, every awkward encounter, carved away another layer of denial. Then, one day, I got a call from the licensing board again. Not to reinstate me, not even close, but to inform me that a complaint had been filed against me after my license had been revoked, from a client who'd recently read the article. They wanted a formal statement. The absurdity of it made me laugh. Even stripped of credentials, my past was still catching up. I wrote back honestly this time. No defensiveness, no therapy jargon. Just, I made mistakes. I manipulated people who trusted me. I can't undo it. I accept whatever judgment you make. It felt strange, freeing, even. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the outcome. I was simply facing it. I used to think there was a limit to how much someone could lose. Turns out, there isn't. Loss doesn't stop when you've hit the ground. It keeps taking time, dignity, energy. You learn that when your mistakes are public record and your name sits one Google search away from shame. That's where I lived for months. The complaint the board received didn't lead to new punishment, but it reopened everything. I had to relive the affair, the manipulation, the ethical violations in written statements and phone calls. Every word was a reminder. I'd been caught once, but this time, I had to confront how I'd rationalized it. I realized that even in my earlier apologies, part of me had still been defending myself. Now, there was no one left to defend against. Just me, and what I'd done. I remember standing in line at the grocery store after one of those calls. I was holding instant noodles, off-brand cereal, and a single apple. The total came to $6.83, and I counted coins to pay. The cashier looked at me the way I used to look at clients who'd lost everything: quiet pity, polite distance. That's when it hit me that I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was surviving. My apartment lease ended that month. I couldn't renew. The rent had gone up again, and even with the night shifts, I was behind. The landlord didn't yell, he just gave me notice. I packed what I could carry: clothes, a box of notebooks, my license certificate that no longer meant anything. The rest went in the dumpster. I stayed with an old acquaintance for a few weeks. She didn't ask for rent, just help around the house. I cleaned, cooked, stayed invisible. But secrets rot relationships. She started dating someone who recognized me from the article. The whispers started, questions about that therapist who got caught. I left before she had to ask me to. I found a room in a shared house after that. 4 people, 1 bathroom, no privacy. It was cheap and temporary, and I told myself that was fine. The others didn't talk much, which was good. I didn't have the energy for small talk. Nights were the worst. I'd hear laughter from the living room while I lay awake thinking about how predictable my downfall had been. The money ran thin again. I started selling old therapy books online. Some were annotated from graduate school, full of notes about ethics, empathy, and self-awareness. The irony burned every time someone bought one. My past self was smarter than I'd been in practice. Then came a letter from Daniel's lawyer. It wasn't about money, just closure. They needed my signature on final property releases. The paperwork was clean and professional. His signature looked steady. Mine shook. When I mailed it back, I felt something final click inside me. Whatever version of me had existed with him was gone. The next few weeks blurred together. I worked, ate, slept. I stopped drinking, not out of discipline, but because it was too expensive. I started drinking water from the tap and eating rice mixed with canned beans. Vegetarianism wasn't a choice anymore, it was survival food. I didn't taste anything. Then, my phone rang again. It was my mother. We hadn't spoken in months. Her voice was cautious, soft in a way that hurt to hear. She said my father had been sick and wanted to see me. I went home that weekend, the first time in over a year. Walking into that house felt like stepping into an old photograph. Everything was familiar but distant. My father didn't say much. He just looked at me, thinner, weaker, still disappointed. He said, "I don't understand what happened to you." I told him the truth, that I thought I could control everything and ended up controlling nothing. He nodded once and said, "That's the thing about consequences. You can't negotiate them." That line stayed with me. My mother made me stay 2 nights. We didn't talk about forgiveness. We just coexisted in quiet. When I left, she hugged me like she used to. It wasn't absolution, but it was human contact I hadn't realized I needed. Back at the shared house, one of the roommates had stolen from me $40 from a drawer, my last bit of cash. I didn't confront him. I didn't have the strength. It felt like one more tax for the person I'd been. I told myself I deserved it and started walking to work again instead of taking the bus. Then, something small but strange happened. The grocery store where I stocked shelves promoted me to the register. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in years someone trusted me with responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd abused trust before, now I was earning it back in the smallest, most ordinary way. The rhythm of life became steady, almost dull. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. I stopped thinking about my old career, my old name, my old self. I became invisible, and there was a strange peace in that. The chaos had finally burned itself out. But then another storm came, smaller yet sharper. I got an email from a legal office. The state wanted to formally close my case with a notation of permanent disciplinary record. It wasn't a surprise, but seeing it written like that, permanent, hit me hard. My mistake wasn't just part of my past, it was part of my identity forever. I didn't cry this time. I sat with it. The word permanent didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like truth. Every action leaves residue. Mine just happened to be public. The next month, Daniel's new partner sent me a message. Not cruel, not angry, just direct. She said she hoped I was getting help, that Daniel had found peace, and that she didn't wish me harm. It was kind, which somehow hurt more than cruelty would have. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. I started journaling again after that. Not for therapy, for record. I wanted to document what accountability actually felt like day to day. It wasn't cinematic. It was repetitive, exhausting, lonely. But in its monotony, I found honesty. Every line reminded me of what I'd lost and what I'd learned to live without. Winter came early that year. My room was cold, the heat unreliable. I wore 3 layers to bed and kept my shoes near the mattress in case of leaks from the roof. I didn't complain. Complaining would have implied I expected better. I didn't anymore. At work, one of the younger cashiers asked if I'd always been just a cashier. The word just stung, but I smiled and said yes. There was no point in telling the story. I wasn't that person anymore, and maybe that was for the best. I got sick again around February, a lingering cough that wouldn't go away. I couldn't afford a doctor, so I wrote it out with tea and over-the-counter medicine. Lying in bed, I thought about how far I'd fallen from the woman who once advised others about self-care and balance. This was the balance now, learning to endure the weight of my own decisions. Sometimes, I'd walk by therapy offices and glance at the names on the doors. New faces, new practitioners. I wondered if any of them had read about me in training, a cautionary tale filed under ethical misconduct. If they had, I hoped they learned something. My story was ugly, but it had value in its warning: power without humility always collapses. Around that time, I started volunteering at a shelter once a week. It wasn't redemption, just routine. I helped organize donations, hand out meals, clean up after shifts. No one asked who I was, and I didn't tell them. It was the first environment in years where I wasn't defined by my past. Just another pair of hands doing something useful. The director noticed my consistency and asked if I'd consider helping with intake paperwork. I said yes. It wasn't therapy, but it was familiar: listening, writing, witnessing. I found a small piece of myself again in that work. Not the therapist, but the human. That spring, my father passed away. I went home for the funeral. The ceremony was small. My mother stood next to me, silent, holding my hand. After everyone left, she said, "He was proud of you once. He would have wanted you to find peace." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was close. I went back to the city the next day and sat in my room for hours, thinking about all the consequences that had rippled outward from a single string of selfish decisions. My husband, my family, my clients, every one of them had paid for my actions in some way. I used to believe consequences only punished the person who made the mistake. I know better now. They spread like cracks in glass. That night, I wrote a final journal entry. I am no longer a therapist. I am no longer a wife. I am a person learning to live with the truth. I reaped what I sowed, and it was enough to feed me for years of regret. But regret is still nourishment, bitter but real. And for the first time, I'm full. When spring turned to summer, I thought things had finally leveled out. My schedule was steady, the volunteer work gave my days a frame, and I'd stopped expecting surprises. That was when the eviction notice came. The owner had decided to sell the building. We all had 30 days to leave. It wasn't personal, just business. I read the notice 3 times, then folded it neatly and put it on my pillow. I didn't have savings, no security deposit for a new place. I told myself I'd figure it out. That was a lie. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I spent the next week walking the city after work, checking bulletin boards and classified ads. Rooms for rent, sublets, shared spaces, all too expensive or already filled. Each no stripped away another piece of my illusion of stability. I tried staying longer at the shelter after my shifts there. The director noticed and gently asked if I was okay. I told her the truth, that I didn't have anywhere to go. She said I could sleep in the staff lounge for a few nights until I found something. I thanked her and tried not to cry. Sleeping there was humbling. The fluorescent lights never went off completely, and the hum of the refrigerators filled the silence. I'd lie awake listening to people outside laughing, sirens in the distance, the steady thrum of the city that no longer felt like mine. The nights blurred together. I worked, slept on a borrowed couch, showered in the staff bathroom. It wasn't homelessness in the traditional sense, but it was close enough to taste it. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't want pity. Then, one night, the director told me I'd have to leave by the weekend, liability reasons, policy. I understood. I didn't argue. I packed my things, the same bag I'd been carrying for months, and left quietly. I spent the next 2 nights at an all-night cafe, ordering the cheapest coffee to justify staying. I watched people come and go, students, couples, workers, everyone with somewhere to be. I had nowhere. That was the moment I realized I'd reached the edge of rock bottom. The morning of the 3rd day, I went to a public park. I sat on a bench, exhausted, and thought about every step that had brought me here, The affair, the lies, the arrogance, the manipulations. I thought about Daniel, my family, my clients. Every face blurred into one word: consequence. Around noon, I walked back to the shelter, not as a volunteer this time, but as someone asking for a bed. The woman at the desk didn't recognize me at first. When she did, her expression softened, then shifted into professionalism. She handed me a form. "We have space in the women's dorm," she said. I nodded and signed. That night, I lay in a narrow cot surrounded by quiet breathing and the smell of detergent. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights again, realizing I'd come full circle. Living in the shelter changed how I saw everything. The people there weren't stories to analyze, they were lives in motion, fragile and raw. Some were escaping abuse, some addiction, some bad luck. I fit somewhere in between. Days became weeks. I found part-time cleaning work through one of the shelter's job boards. It paid little, but it covered bus fare and food. My meals were basic: instant noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, fruit when I could afford it. I stopped thinking about taste altogether. Food was just fuel to keep moving. One evening, while mopping a hallway in an office building, I caught my reflection in a glass door. I barely recognized myself, thinner, paler, hair unkempt. But there was something steady in my eyes I hadn't seen before. Not pride, not shame, just acceptance. I'd finally stopped bargaining with the past. There was nothing left to negotiate. Then, near the end of summer, I got a letter at the shelter. It was from the state board again, a routine closure notice. The case was officially marked complete, sanctions permanent. Reading it didn't sting like before. It felt like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. I folded the paper and put it in my bag. I didn't need to keep it, but I did. Not as a reminder of punishment, but as proof that accountability ends where ownership begins. The next morning, the director asked if I'd consider speaking at a recovery workshop for others who'd lost careers to misconduct. I hesitated. My instinct was to say no, to stay invisible. But I said yes. That night, I wrote down what I'd say. No excuses, no moralizing, just facts. I cheated on my husband, manipulated him, violated professional ethics, lost everything, and ended up here. Actions have consequences. I reaped what I sowed. When I stood at the podium a week later, my hands shook. The room was half full: ex-nurses, ex-teachers, a few people from correctional programs. I told my story. Some people looked away, others nodded. I didn't look for approval. I just spoke. When it was over, no one clapped. That felt right. Accountability doesn't earn applause. It just asks for honesty. That night, walking back to the shelter, I felt lighter. Not happy, but unburdened. For the first time, the story wasn't something that controlled me. It was something I could name out loud and leave behind, piece by piece. I thought speaking at that workshop would be the end of my story, but endings never announce themselves. Life keeps testing you until you stop trying to pass the test. After the talk, a few people stayed behind. One woman said she'd lost her nursing license after taking medication home. She told me she related to the arrogance, the slow slide from intention to justification. I listened. For the first time in years, listening felt clean: no power, no agenda, just presence. The shelter director asked if I wanted to keep helping with those sessions. I agreed. Twice a month, I'd stand in that same room and repeat the same line: actions have consequences. You can't outsmart them. Every time I said it, it felt less like punishment and more like truth I'd earned. Then winter came again, and the shelter's funding was cut. Beds were reduced. I was among the first to be asked to leave. The director apologized. She even cried. I told her not to. I understood. I'd spent a year rebuilding something fragile, and now it was gone. That's how consequences work. They don't stop at one lesson. I packed my bag again. The city was colder this time, wind slicing through the streets. I spent 2 nights on a bus that ran 24 hours, riding loops to stay warm. By morning, my back ached, and I'd spent half my remaining money on fares. Rock bottom wasn't a moment anymore, it was a landscape. On the 3rd morning, I went to the public library. It was warm, quiet, anonymous. I started spending days there, reading job listings, sometimes just sitting. I'd watch people work on laptops, meet friends, live lives untouched by my history. I didn't envy them. I just observed, like watching a world I used to belong to. One afternoon, I overheard a student explaining a psychology assignment: ethical boundaries in counseling. The words hit like static. I realized my case could easily be one of the examples in their syllabus. I left before they could mention names. Outside, the wind burned my face, and I laughed once, sharp and tired. I became the cautionary tale I used to assign. Days blurred again. I got sick, bronchitis that wouldn't ease up. The clinic treated me for free, antibiotics and advice. The nurse didn't ask what I did for a living, and I didn't volunteer it. I was just another patient, coughing through the winter. When I started to recover, I went back to the shelter. A new coordinator had replaced the director. She recognized me from old volunteer logs and offered a cleaning shift in exchange for meals. I accepted. That job saved me? It wasn't therapy, but it was structure. I swept floors, served food, mended sheets. No one asked about my past, and I didn't offer it. In that small routine, I found the closest thing to peace I'd ever had. One night after closing, I sat in the dining hall alone. The lights were low, chairs stacked, air still heavy with detergent. I looked around and thought about the chain of cause and effect that had brought me there. One lie, one boundary crossed, one choice ignored. Each had seemed small, almost invisible, until they formed a wall I couldn't climb. I whispered out loud, "This is what accountability looks like." The words sounded steadier than I expected. A few weeks later, I received another letter, forwarded from my mother's address. It was from the state archive confirming my disciplinary record had been finalized and made public. Anyone could read it now. I expected shame. What I felt instead was relief. There was nothing left to hide. I mailed a short note to my mother after that. I thanked her for forwarding the mail and told her I was okay. She wrote back 2 weeks later. The letter was brief but kind. "I'm glad you're safe. Come visit when you can." I visited in early spring. The house felt smaller. My mother had aged, I had too. We sat at the kitchen table drinking tea. She asked nothing about the past. She just said, "You seem calmer." I told her it wasn't calm, just acceptance. She nodded. When I left, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a grocery store gift card and a note that said, "Everyone reaps what they sow. I hope you're planting something new." Back in the city, I used that card to buy fresh vegetables, the first real food I'd had in months. I cooked them in the shelter kitchen, shared them with others. It felt symbolic, almost ceremonial, trading ramen for something grown. By summer, I'd saved enough to rent a room again. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a lock, but it was mine. I kept working at the shelter, sometimes speaking at recovery groups, sometimes cleaning floors. The routine held me steady. Occasionally, I'd see couples on the street, laughing, arguing, holding hands, and think of Daniel. I didn't miss him in the romantic sense anymore. I missed the version of myself who hadn't yet learned what destruction she was capable of. That innocence was gone forever, and that was right. The last true fall came quietly. One of the residents at the shelter recognized me from an old news article and told others. For a week, whispers followed me, murmurs about the therapist who cheated. I almost quit. But then one of the women I'd served meals to said, "You are still here helping us. That's what matters." That single sentence anchored me. That night, I wrote in my journal, "This is rock bottom, not the loss, but the acceptance of it. There's no ladder out, just time and truth." I kept that page open on my desk for days. Every morning I'd read it before work. The words didn't promise redemption. They just reminded me that survival is also a kind of consequence, one you have to live through, not around. Months passed. Seasons shifted. My life stayed small, but steady. The shelter work turned into a paid position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I earned just enough to live, to eat something beyond instant noodles, to sleep without dread. When people asked my story, I told them the short version. I made terrible choices. I paid for them. Now I work here. Nothing more. That was enough. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing echoes of the past, the tone of Daniel's voice, the email from the board, my father's words. They're reminders, not ghosts. They keep me honest. I know now that rock bottom isn't a place you escape. It's a foundation you learn to live on. It teaches you to stop running from consequences and start standing on them. I lost everything because I believed I could control the narrative. What I've gained is smaller, quieter, and real. I eat vegetables when I can, ramen when I can't. I work, I sleep, I tell the truth. Every day is ordinary, and that ordinariness is the only redemption I deserve. And if anyone ever asks me what happened to the therapist who thought she could outsmart the truth, I'll tell them simply, she reaped what she sowed. She's still here, still accountable, still learning to live with it.